Hey gamers, this is episode 11 of The Art of Warfare. Today we look at the Tier 6 armored fighting vehicle, the M2 Bradley, per viewer request. For this tank I really recommend using Sabrina. Actually, for any armored fighting vehicle, I recommend maxing out the vision, and Sabrina also gives benefits to camo. And even though this is technically called a fire support vehicle, in my opinion the best thing that an AFV can bring to a battle is its ability to spot tanks from range. And you might get outspotted by other AFVs such as the VBL, which have superior camo and vision mechanics, but you can pretty much outspot anything else. In terms of crew skills, for the gunner you want to select shoot from the hip, which limits the maximum reticle size, and then marksman when you get to tier 4, and this will help keep your aiming reticle tight so that you can hit your targets, and especially for targeting weak spots. The tank has two different weapons you can swap between: the autocannon, which has pretty solid penetrations with the AP rounds, and I'll show you how to penetrate main battle tanks from the side, not only from the rear. And then it has a pretty potent anti-tank guided missile, which has 2 missiles per salvo, which each deliver 420 damage, so if both missiles penetrate you can deliver up to 840 damage. I don't really recommend using high explosive. It's a really bad habit of a lot of AFV drivers, unless your opponent is under 100 hit points. The Bradley is slower than a lot of armored fighting vehicles. You can see it's just barely outpacing a light tank here in terms of its forward speed, and then its reverse speed caps out pretty quickly at 32 kilometers per hour, so you want to be careful about getting yourself in situations where you need to use your speed to get out. Basically, it doesn't have good escapability. I'm going to show you 2 battles. This first one is my first battle in the Bradley. This is Narrows, and we have the southwest spawn. There are a couple different areas you can go spot. Some people like to spot the 8-9 line or the little hill from H6 to try to spot their tanks along the 4, 5, and 6 lines. Where I'm going to go is going to enable me to spot the E line, and especially the crossing along the 8 line for their MBTs. As it turns out, they have a Fox which is spotting way too aggressively. You really shouldn't cross the E or F line early on in the battle until you've got a good sense of the opponent's deployment, because by moving up so quickly, he enabled me to take off the vast majority of his hit points and then get finished off by an opponent. Really, you don't want to push mid on any map too early, especially in a 15 versus 15, because the probability is too high that you're going to get shot at by multiple tanks. The one thing that the Fox did do for his team was keep me lit, so I got hit by an MBT-70 who I spotted up along the 8 line. And really, if I want to spot the tanks down along the 9 line, I'll need to push a little bit more forward to the east. But for now, I'm just content to sit and get a sense of their deployment. I don't recommend spawning from the south spawn, the 1-2 lines, and part of the problem is that you can too easily get spotted from a short distance from tanks that have pushed up to the E line, and then you can get, once you're lit, you'll get hit by tanks that are sniping back along A2 and A3, which is a very good spot for snipers on the north spawn. For an AFV, it's important to try to set yourself up so you're not redundant with other armored fighting vehicles, and this is how you penetrate MBTs from the side. You aim in between the treads of the tracks, kind of the lower third of the hull, and for most MBTs that is a relatively soft area from the side, and I put designate on this target on this tank and then hit him with 2 guided missiles for max damage of 483. Now you'll notice the earlier missile that I fired actually hit the rocks in front of me, so even though the model of the tank has the missile launcher on the top of the turret, the missile actually fires from the body. I think that's a bug, but what it means is if you're going to use your missiles, you need to expose your hull, which means you're a much bigger target. I've come over here to help very briefly along the 1-2 line. I can't stay here because this tank, like most AFVs, or really all AFVs, is not really built to brawl very effectively, so I try to work in just a little bit of damage, and what I want to do is move out to a sufficient distance where I can keep the enemy spotted, but also work in my weapons. And generally speaking, you'll need about 3 to 4 mini-map squares away from main battle tanks to fire on them safely. I go ahead and designate one of their tier 6 MBTs here, and then this T-Series MBT, I almost have some decent AGTM shots along the side of the hull, but there's a little bit of a ridge in between us, and it's really important to not try to force shot. So right here, I am in the view range of 3 or 4 of their tanks, so you don't want to try to fire your one gun when you might eat 3 shots in return. It's just not worth it, and it's more important to conserve your hit points so that you can help carry late. I have significantly weakened that Centauro TD, and I was taking some blind shots in the hopes of finishing him off. We have to be careful, like looking at the minimap, our MBT platoon, which is made up of some pretty good players, has done really well winning the 8-9 line, but obviously we've lost the western side of the map. And the most important thing for me is to stay alive and help give continued spotting so I can keep my friendly tanks active in terms of their guns and also give a sense of their deployment. I have been designated by the opposing Fox driver, so what I'm going to want to do here is keep driving around below the ridge, stay in the ditch until that designate wears off, and in the meanwhile I'll see if I can spot any targets. And I can tell right there's some autocannon fire coming in. That's probably the Fox, and so I want to be very careful. The Fox does have better vision mechanics than the M2 Bradley, and they're starting to cap our base, and I'm not going to be too worried yet until they get a second capper on there. I'm pretty close by, so I'm going to keep an eye on that cap timer and try to get a sense of how many tanks they have going into our cap. But what I want to do is find a position where I can spot this middle half of the map, the F and G lines, to help our tanks figure out where they are. I'm not going to go down to the J line. We already have a lot of tanks down there, and I don't want to get stuck in traffic and be redundant with the same firing lanes that they have. And the Fox is driving toward the south. I take a few blind fire shots. I can't tell before he crosses into an area whether or not I might have a shot, so I'm leading him in the case that he comes up on the top of the ridge and I have a shot on him. That bagel was lit very briefly, but just a little bit of a hard shot to make. And then again, I'm taking a look here to see if I have any autocannon shots potentially on these tanks. The timer keeps flickering down, sometimes right below 1 minute, which means that a second person is getting on the cap. And now that we've won the 8-9 line, then I can go ahead and push toward the western side of the map. And one really important thing is, in any armored fighting vehicle, you don't want to push too far. You don't want to outpush your support, meaning if you're out so far ahead and you're YOLOing and you're lighting enemy tanks, but there are no friendlies to support you and firing them, you're really wasting your time. And not only that, you're probably going to waste a lot of your hit points too. It's okay if you're pushing on a solo tank because you're going to be able to flank and wreck them, but you don't want to be pushing up solo. Now here's a good example of why, pushing up on a different lane from the rest of those tanks, it gave me a field of fire on that Fox and I was able to finish him off. Now they don't have any more vision control. And granted, the tanks they have in the cap, by the time I get close to the cap, they're going to proximity spot me. At that point, vision and camo really isn't a factor. But what you'll see is one of their cappers is a Soviet T-Series tank. So what I'm going to do as soon as he pops up here is aim in the lower third of his hull, down beneath the tracks, and get really good damage on him. It's a very good way to not have to get on the rear side of an MBT, because that can be difficult. I've heard some players telling me that they have trouble penetrating MBTs on the sides. At least through tier 6 this works reasonably consistently, and it depends on, some of the MBTs have softer side armor. You'll see a good example with this T-Series, again shooting down below the top and bottom tracks in between that area to finish off that remaining player. So this was my first battle in the M2 Bradley. Learned a lot, especially about the positioning of where the missiles fire out of. And we're going to hop into another battle in just a moment, but I was able to deliver about 3,700 damage and spot 7 tanks. Alright, we're going to look at a much tougher scenario in this Tier 8 Port Storm battle. They are loaded with tons of MBTs, both sides are, and obviously those tanks can be pretty difficult to penetrate from a frontal perspective. Now, this tank does have anti-tank guided missiles, which you can aim and hit weak spots from range, which can get full damaging penetrations. And you'll notice I use my autocannon as I'm heading out to my initial spotting point to clear out some of the destructible terrain, such as walls, and that'll help both me and my allies not get slowed down by the walls. And I do this a lot, on maps like this, just clearing out areas, and you'll see me do it again later, because you have so many hundreds of AP shells that you're never going to run out. From the south spawn, you have 2 areas where you can spot from. One is the B0, C0, there's a little hill and a rock, and then the other one is this area right here by E3. And we already have a Weasel who's kind of covering the 0 and 1 lines, and I don't want to be redundant with him. The only time, sometimes you can wolf pack with AFVs, and it's helpful if you're trying to isolate an opponent and finish them off. But generally speaking, I'd rather have a separate field of fire, so if I spot something, maybe the Weasel can shoot it or vice versa. And here's a great example. Their Centauro 170 was kind of taking a high line along the ridge, and I get almost a full clip's worth of damage, but it put him down about 1,200 hit points, so he's now one-shottable by a lot of the friendly tanks that we have in this match. And that's like a critical thing, because that Centauro 120 has the scariest gun of any tank in this battle. It's capable of dealing 700 damage per AP shot. Now that Weasel can be a pretty tough target to hit, from a distance, and I was also not leading him out enough, so I didn't get much damage on him. But thankfully what happens in a minute here, our weasel's staying right on the other side of the rock, and then our second weasel has pushed up to support our first weasel. So we have some pretty good sight lines here. There's another MBT coming up. This is a challenger. I go ahead and designate him in case our friendlies can fire on him, and then since we're spotted, there are 3 of us clustered here, I go ahead and pop my 1 use of smokes to cover the 3 of us. Now, I can't really stay here for too much longer. There is another AFV here. This is a BMD4, the tier 7, so we get damage into him and he gets finished off. But I can't stay here too long because their tier 7 and tier 8 MBTs are pushing up, and once they get any closer, they're going to spot me based on, you know, proximity. It's so close that camo is not going to be any kind of a factor here. So I don't want to drive backwards to retreat. As I showed in that earlier clip on Ghost Field, it's a very slow tank to go in reverse. So what you want to do is turn around, make sure you have the time to drive away, to, you know, anticipate the trouble and start driving away from it. And then I cut to the east across the road just to get out of line of sight of the challenger. I'm going to cut back, and what I want to do is retreat far enough south so that I can still keep their tanks lit, but use my anti-tank guided missiles and, if possible, my autocannon. I make a bit of a mistake there. I really should have just kept heading south because I'm too close to them. They still got me spotted. They're taking some shots, and thankfully, based on the distance and my movement, it's making it difficult for them to hit me. But you know, you really want to get out at least 3 to 4 squares, and you want the distance to be higher as you go up in tiers because MBTs get an increasing amount of vision compared to other classes of tanks. And so if I get far enough away, they'll still be within my wide circle where I can easily spot them, since MBTs have very poor camo, but I'll be able to use my missiles and weapons without being lit. This challenger is already designated. I go ahead and fire 2 anti-tank guided missiles, and the first one doesn't pen actually. That's kind of unfortunate because it's showing a green indicator, but the second one tags him because it's designated for the max 483 damage, which is a nice chunk off of his health. And once that designate wears off, that was applied by one of the weasels, I'm going to go ahead and keep him designated. Now, unfortunately, he drops from vision right before I can finish that cast of the designate, but it's a good way of really discouraging opposing tanks, especially MBTs, from moving forward because they know that they're just constantly being spotted, and you know, they're feeling the pain from our Centauro 120s. We've got a platoon of them, and you know, they're able to deliver a lot of damage. I will say that, you know, it's starting in tier 5 to 6 and above. I actually don't recommend running a triple platoon of the same thing unless they're MBTs, because if you go with 3 AFVs, 3 TDs, or 3 light tanks, what usually happens is your team, especially if you're the top tier, is going to be too low in terms of the count of MBTs, and MBTs can really bully tanks, especially starting from tier 6 and up. So you'd also never want to really pass up an open opportunity to good shot, so that I backed up a little bit so I can get back on top of this ridge since I have shots on this MBT. And the second one just clips the top of his turret, so I get partial damage there, and then I designate him, and our Centauro 120 and Centauro finish him off. And what our Centauro has sensed up ahead of me, you know, he's over by the D1 area, is that they're thin on the western side of the map. They don't have anyone along A0, A1, and so you know, this is going to give us an opportunity to flank. And we certainly don't want to go into city, the majority of us, because we are, you know, Stingray 2, Centauro 120, me, you know, we're not built to brawl or to exchange at close range. So what we're hoping to do is collapse the west side of the map so we can come around by the A line around A5 and A4 and then shoot down on the soft sides of their tank. So their MBTs are doing the right thing in terms of supporting each other in the city, but they really could have used just even one tank to sit out there on the A line and, you know, just hold the corner so we can't move around the map like this. And I haven't taken any damage so far. I've been pretty careful. Obviously, you know, when facing a lot of tier 7s and 8s, you have to be careful because their gun alpha, the gun handling, accuracy, the penetration, you know, all those things are going to be very high, and you're going to find yourself outgunned. But I've been pretty patient and, you know, working in some damage on softer targets, using missiles on others. And, you know, while I'm not carrying the damage for our team, we've got, you know, keeping our numbers up is important because we're already down 6 to 8. Like on paper, in a lot of cases, this is a match that we would most likely lose, because they have, you know, more remaining MBTs than we do, especially in the upper tiers. But we're doing a good job of collapsing the flank, and like that, I think that Centauro, the 120 came up and over the top and finished off that Leo MBT before I could get the kill with the anti-tank guided missiles. So running really quickly, the last tank they have out here on the west is going to be their Artie, and we want to kill him, you know, obviously because he's Artie, we don't want to get, you know, dumped on from a distance, but also once we kill him, then they don't have any spotters along the A or B line anymore to give any intelligence about, you know, where they're at. So we've closed the gap to 5-5, and our tank destroyers are playing up on the top of the hill, which is pretty important and smart because they're going to be able to leverage the hard cover. And then again, just making sure these walls are not an obstruction for us, I go ahead and remove them using my autocannon. It's a nice little tool or trick. And as I come up here, I'm going to be switching over to the anti-tank guided missiles before I even see anything. But I got to be careful. I've been spotted. The safest thing to do if you've been spotted by a tank on the other side of the ridge is stay on the far side of the road like this so that you minimize how much of your tank's profile they can see. And what I'm trying to do is get to a position where I can spot a tank and then hit him with my anti-tank guided missiles. And this Centauro, or this Challenger rather, is already focused on another tank, so I'm able to sit safely. You want to be careful about using your anti-tank guided missiles because they do require you to be fully visible while you're firing the missiles. And then, as I talked about earlier, at least for the initial firing of the missiles, you need to have your hull visible because that's where the missiles come out of. And again, I think that's a bug. Maybe it'll get fixed. And here I'm whittling away that Challenger using high explosive. It's, like I said, something that really you should avoid doing unless your opponent is at under 100 hit points or less, because in most cases, if you've got AP rounds that you can use and you have the sides or rear of your opponent, it's better just to use those. So in this battle, I was able to deliver around 3,000 damage and 1,700 in spotting. And we definitely had some very heavy damage delivered from our top tier Centauro 120, but by virtue of keeping my gun active throughout the match and being smart, I was able to outdamage most of the tier 7 and 8 tanks in here. I was able to get to a 60% win rate before unlocking the BMD4, and I think with more careful gameplay, just maintaining that 3 square distance, you could probably get your damage ratio higher, or damage per game higher than what I have at 2100. But I think the M2 Bradley, a lot of people struggle with the tank, but they're not respecting its limitations in terms of its speed. It does have some pretty trollish armor, especially against AFVs and their autocannons, and then it has really good anti-tank guided missiles. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the Typhoon. That's the tank that you get through the Collector's Edition. I think it's probably the most underestimated and underrated tank in the entire game, and it's one of my favorites. Look forward to talking about that tank, and let me know your questions and comments about this video. Take care.